Cool, let's get started then. Hi everyone, you're listening to The Blockchain Socialist, and for today's guest, I have Ethan Buchman. He is the founder of Cosmos and the CEO of Informal Systems. So hey Ethan, how you doing?
Great, thanks. Thanks for having me.
So maybe to start off, just for people who may not know you, could you give a brief introduction to yourself and how you got into the blockchain world?
Sure. I'm Ethan. I'm a co-founder of the Cosmos project, which we wrote the white paper for that back in 2016. My background is in a mix of things. I graduated with a degree in physical science with a focus on biophysics. Specifically, the origin of life was sort of the problem that captured me, namely, how is it in the universe that's always running down? Do we get organisms and living systems that run themselves up? And this seemed like an important thing to answer. And sometime in 2013, I discovered Bitcoin, and in a previous year, I had sort of seen it and dismissed it because I didn't understand it, and I didn't know what all the cryptographic primitives were that it was using. And in 2013, I dove in a little bit more and came to understand that Bitcoin seemed like the kind of phenomenon I was studying, the origin of life, happening in the digital medium, where you have this sort of self-emergent organizing network, essentially, that is persistent, that has an identity, that sort of lives on through time, that can defend itself, and so on. And so that just completely fascinated me. And it seemed like, if the internet was kind of a biological revolution in communication, then maybe Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies were a subsequent revolution in coordination. And that seemed very important. And I've pretty much been kind of all in since then, working professionally in the crypto space, basically since 2014. And then eventually founding Cosmos in 2016 and working on that ever since.
How did you relate your work in biophysics to? Was it because you already knew programming and could just already utilize that into this?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, I had always been. I got into programming in high school, I guess, in grade 10 or something. So I had some basic understanding of computer science. What I was really trying to do, through most of my undergrad, let's say, and when I started my master's degree, I was largely not really concerned with larger political economic issues. I was mostly kind of narrowly focused on grand problems in physics or neuroscience or cell biology, the origin of life, trying to find a grand unified theory of everything. Let's say that was kind of my drive. And at some point that started to be challenged a bit by metaphysics and existentialism and spirituality and these kinds of discoveries, which led me, maybe somewhat perversely, but I think also interestingly, to pursue a somewhat moral physics, and to try to understand how a sort of metaphysics or existentialist position might be derived from a physical understanding or biophysical understanding, which led me to sort of what I call today, which is maybe my philosophical basis of sustainability existentialism. We can get into that maybe later on, but somewhere throughout university, I ended up being turned on to the problems with economics and society and issues around how things are funded and financialization, and became quite disenchanted with the academic establishment. Before then, I figured I'd be a professor and would never have to do anything else, and then things changed quite dramatically when I realized how morally corrupt so much of our institutions are. And so that led me to really think about these problems of coordination and of organisms and sustainability. I had discovered permaculture and local agriculture and how to grow food to support the population. And in thinking about the origin of life and the problem of an organism kind of sustaining itself, started to apply that lens to society and how socioeconomic systems are kind of like organisms, and you need to apply a similar lens to them in terms of how they respond to their environments and how they sustain themselves and how they consume inputs and use them to grow and reproduce and live over time, and what that means. And so sort of realized that we were lacking, I think, a theory for how to do that and institutions that do that well. And I like to say that so much of how our society is structured is more like a tornado than an organism. We don't really effectively represent our boundaries. We're sort of spiraling, and we're just going to crash into our resource limit, which is kind of what's happening with modern economies. And what I saw in cryptocurrencies and the sort of coordination function that they provide was a new way to represent the interests of society and to coordinate better to sort of mitigate those crises, let's say.
Yeah, that's really interesting. We'll get into like a bunch of things that you just said in a bit. I think for sure we'll have plenty of political discussion that'll be really spicy potentially and really entertaining. But let's start off with the purpose of Cosmos, because it is a really interesting project. Why do you think it is an important project? I mean, of course you founded it, but like, why is it important that it achieves its goals, specifically of basically creating what seems to me like the ultimate sort of interoperability layer across different blockchains?
Yeah. So we frame the kind of key goals or the philosophical foundation and the values of Cosmos as sovereignty and interoperability, right? And there's really a kind of deeper political economic aspiration there for the kinds of technologies we want to exist and what we want communities to be enabled to do with them, right? And everyone who's building in the blockchain space is talking about the same kind of issues in political economy, the monopolization of corporations and the sort of exploitation of the network effect, and the way social media is eroding democracy, all these kinds of things, lack of user sovereignty, and so on. And then the solution is always, okay, well, we'll build the one true blockchain system, and everyone will use our one blockchain network, and if everyone uses it, that will solve all the world's problems, and kumbaya. And that struck us as somehow wrong. And the vision has sort of evolved.
So you were sort of
back
against.
In 2016, it was a little bit like.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say that this is sort of against the idea of like Ethereum's the world computer type of thing.
That's right. Yeah. So in our minds, there were going to be many blockchains, and each of them had a right to exist and could solve different purposes and really would serve different communities and different stakeholders. And what we needed was to build tools, not to build the one true blockchain, but to enable this proliferation of blockchains to represent the values of the heterogeneous communities all over the world, and yet for them to still be interoperable with each other, right? So we wanted them to have sort of sovereignty over their infrastructure, their application, the expression of their own values, and yet to be interoperable with the many other sovereign communities out there, right? And so that was really the sort of core ethos of Cosmos, was to facilitate that. Now that's sort of how the vision has expanded in its let's say larger political economic scope. Sort of more narrowly at the beginning, it was really about, okay, let's solve key problems in the blockchain space. If we're going to have a proliferation of blockchains, they can't all use proof of work. That's going to be too expensive. We need good tools to actually develop them. We need them to have good protocols and so on. And so many of the pieces we've built over the years, the Tendermint consensus engine, the application blockchain interface to separate consensus from building applications, like all these things enabled many advances. These are sort of public goods we've put out over the years, obviously all open source, that have enabled a proliferation of people building blockchains, using the tools that are right for them, the programming languages that are right for them, and representing the sort of using mechanisms and representing values that are right for their communities. And the sort of larger Cosmos vision is to enable them all to be kind of stitched together using IBC in the way that makes sense, without a sort of top-down prescriptive topology, but in a way that is a bit more bottom-up and emergent, right? And in the midst of that, of course, there is one blockchain maybe we care a bit more about than all the others. We call that one the Cosmos Hub. It hosts the Atom token. That was sort of the Schelling point, that there was a lot of coordination around to actually fund a lot of this development and so on. But unlike many other projects, the Cosmos Hub community isn't a sort of maximalist community. It's not like this is the one true blockchain. It has no special privileges in the network topology. We call it a hub, but its hub functionality is emergent and it needs to be earned. It's not something that's sort of prescribed or forced, so it's not like rent seeking in that kind of way. It's a hub insofar as it will provide value to those to connect to it. And like all the other chains that are being built, in application specific ways, the hub is being built to be a specific application that serves the needs of many other chains trying to connect to each other. So it's a little bit more forward looking to say, okay, there's going to be all these chains, they're going to have needs for connectivity. The Cosmos Hub can sort of provide that. So along the way, Cosmos has tried to deliver. First, we proved proof of stake could work. at scale, and now everyone's using proof of stake. The application specific chains was sort of a big push from the Cosmos community that not everyone's going to want to build on Ethereum. They'll want their own chains. They'll want their own sovereignty. And of course, we're seeing that prove out. And then the next big piece was this like interoperability standard, what we call IBC, the Inter-Blockchain Communication Protocol, which is really like one of the key pieces of Cosmos that enables these different sovereign chains, regardless of their sort of underlying structure or consensus or application, to still communicate reliably with each other.
So Informal Systems is one of these entities that are helping build out Cosmos, as far as I understand, and it's run as a cooperative, which I felt was like really interesting. Why that there was like such an entity that was formed as a cooperative. I mean, one of the interesting things that I notice in the blockchain space sometimes, in the crypto space, especially in the beginning, was like people like to talk about decentralization, but at least from my perspective as a socialist, was like, okay, but what about decentralization of the workplace? Why isn't don't mean to point at them, but like consensus is not a cooperative; it is like a for-profit business, and there is a mismatch there if you're going to talk about decentralization. You're really talking about one type of decentralization versus, and just to sort of cover up the centralization and other parts that there may be. And one of those things is sort of like the corporation as being sort of like the ultimate form, in my opinion, the biggest form of centralization in our lives. So I was really interested to hear like your perspective, why you started it as a cooperative.
Yeah, so there's a lot of things that feed into this, and maybe this will lead us also to larger conversations about political philosophy. But it's my understanding that we have gone way too far down the corporate rabbit hole and sort of lost sight of how we organize society, and the corporation has become the sort of primary vehicle for doing that. And the problem with the corporation is that it insufficiently represents the value contributed by many other stakeholders, right? Or its, let's say, its obligations to many other stakeholders besides the shareholder, right? And so in the American ideal of the corporation as purely existing to deliver profit to shareholders, it just chronically fails to actually represent in its structure the other stakeholders that are involved, which means from a sort of larger sustainability existentialism perspective, it's kind of doomed to failure, right? If you don't sufficiently represent your environment, you can't sustain yourself, and to have a whole society built out of that kind of flawed model, it's just a recipe for disaster. So it's kind of been clear to me for some time now that we do need more cooperative structures that explicitly represent in the kind of state machine of the organization more stakeholders, right? And there's been progress on this. There's a number of different forums. We have B Corps in the US now and elsewhere that try to prioritize other stakeholders. But the nice thing about cooperatives is they really, empower the actual workers of the organization who do, contribute so much value that is so chronically, underrepresented in the structure in a way that, can be very unfair. And I think this is one of the major failures of Silicon Valley and of this kind of model to actually, properly democratize ownership over these companies. So it was really important to us that when we were spinning up Informal, that we would structure it like a workers cooperative. It's still a for-profit entity. We're still, we still have revenue. We're still driven to make money and distribute it to the owners, but the owners are the employees, and they control the company on a one person, one vote basis. So we were exploring sort of a lot of alternative, structures there. So we're not a statutory cooperative. We went, from the outside, we look like a normal private corporation, but from the inside, with our sort of articles and shareholder agreements and bylaws, we have this one person, one vote governance structure. But we also have a separate class of economic shares that are not uniformly distributed, but don't have voting power, right? And so, as the CEO of that company, I'm sort of constantly reminding the employees, like, I'm accountable to you. Not just to myself or not to some like abstract investor, but, I'm here because I earned the position according to the employees, to continue to serve the company and to serve the employees and to build the vision and so on. So I think that's really, really powerful, important. And part of the model we're trying to create with Informal is something that can be reproduced by others. So we want to like export the model and build tools and so on, so other people can easily do it. But we have this notion that, corporations aren't bad. Like shareholder-based corporations aren't inherently bad. It's not like there's something fundamentally wrong. The thing that's fundamentally wrong is that the entire society is built around them, right? And so what we're kind of pushing for is a model where we have more of these sort of cooperative parent companies that can spin out and incubate more shareholder-based, for-profit standard, let's say, high-growth corporations. And that way, the gains from them are sort of more automatically distributed across, the workers in the kind of parent, and that should hopefully help somewhat equalize and distribute ownership and gains and so on. So that's kind of how we're thinking about it. Yeah.
Okay. So like, especially in the beginning, I was like, he's speaking like a socialist, like very much. There's one point where you said, I can't remember what you said right now. You said to own. And I was like, own the means of production, and then you didn't. So close.
I'm but language. I don't like to be put in boxes. Like,
of course, no, I'm not trying to label you. I'm not trying to label you.
Words I come up with myself that no one has existing connotations for. So like, sustainability existentialist, like no one knows what that is because I made it up. So like, I'm cool with that. But like socialist, don't put me in that box.
I won't. Of course, I would never put you in that corner. But I mean, I think it's really interesting. Like, do you find it? I imagine like when you're in a cooperative, there is a different type of thinking than when you're working in a traditional corporation. It's like you have to. I mean, I imagine you have to sort of, like you kind of alluding to, like you have to like remind people, hey, we're cooperative. Remember that.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is day to day, it functions. It can function a lot like a normal company, right? You have a CEO, you have an executive team, you can have a traditional management hierarchy, decision making, however you want. It can look like from the inside, a normal quote unquote hierarchical, authoritarian, if you like, kind of company. It doesn't have to. It certainly can. But at the end of the day, the employees, the workers have control over the executive team, right? They can have a shareholder meeting and fire them, right? And so at the end of the day, if they want that sort of authoritarian structure, they can vote that into place and say, okay, this is how we want the thing to run. No one will know if we don't tell them that it's a cooperative until our annual shareholder meeting, or until we have to overthrow the CEO for doing whatever, right? So it's sort of up to the company how it wants to run. There's a sort of a common misconception, like, oh, you're cooperative. Like, how does anything get done? Is everything, by consensus? Like, how do you get everyone to agree? Like, no, it doesn't have to be like that. Some people, will structure their companies like that, but you can't really scale that. It's very difficult to pursue visions and so on that way. But at the end of the day, in our structure, we do have a CEO, we do have an executive team, we do have quite a bit of a autonomy within the company, and we're trying to culture that and culture as much sort of distributed decision making and clarity over that as possible. But also at the end of the day, I'm accountable to the workers. I know that if I do something they don't like, they can always overthrow me. So we were talking about this kind of funny idea of doing a fire drill, where basically I would fire everyone, and then they would use their they all have termination periods, right? So I could fire everyone because I'm the CEO. I have that power. But then they could call a shareholder meeting and like replace me as CEO and undo the firing and hire themselves back, and then if they want, like, reappoint me as CEO. So that, we're probably not going to do that because it might be a waste of time, but it's a cute concept, I think.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you this because I do feel that informal systems is quite unique in the crypto world. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on the current state of blockchain and Web3, and like, where would you like to see it go? I think some people will argue that Web3 is sort of going in the direction of like hyper financialization, hyper focus, sort of like a repeat almost of like Silicon Valley, but just crypto sort of tacked on top of it.
Yeah.
So I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I agree with this. I'm very concerned about this problem.
Yeah.
I think it's a very real problem, and maybe the biggest risk is that crypto just kind of gets co-opted by Wall Street. There are a few ways to look at it. One is, like, at the end of the day, the crypto revolution, if we can call it that, is going to overall increase certain baseline qualities that I think many people would agree are valuable, right? People are getting an education in security, in the idea of what custody over assets means, how to use private keys to sort of manage authentication and identity and stuff like that, and crypto is kind of raising the bar overall on that. There are other trends happening, 2FA and so on. People are using YubiKeys, and that's not really because of cryptocurrency, but cryptocurrency is sort of accelerating that. The other piece is the sort of, consensus systems and the ability to do kind of multi-stakeholder agreement, which is really what, blockchains are, multi-stakeholder databases. That could really lead to improvements in infrastructure and the sort of political decentralization of infrastructure, even if, cryptocurrencies don't help realize the vision we all think they do. There's sort of that increased, quality. And then, of course, there's the openness, transparency, verifiability, which is really kind of one of the key principles cryptocurrencies are pushing for. Like that's kind of here now. It's out of the bag. It can't go away, right? So unfortunately, though, it looks like, what is kind of happening with DeFi is that we're just getting like a new version of Wall Street where everything is a little bit more transparent and verifiable, right? And so whereas before there were very high barriers to entry and like you couldn't really verify easily what was under the hood, now you can. But other than that, we have like the exact same political economy taking place on top, right? And this bothers me quite substantially because I think it really shows. And when I was younger, I sort of subscribed to this more naive view that technology can't solve all our problems. And a lot of what's happening in blockchain is just like, oh, we have this new technology, it's going to solve all these social problems. And it's like, no, it's not. It might help a little bit. It might like open the playing field or give more access or enable new innovations and so on. But unless we're careful, it will likely quickly be consumed or co-opted by existing, financial interests and structures. And I think that's what we're witnessing. And that's what, we're hoping to, push back on and create something a little bit different.
Yeah. So one of the ways that that I see kind of you and like the Cosmos ecosystem seem to be trying to push back on is this, of course, the meme of the degen. Not sure how I'm supposed to pronounce it. And then to say instead of being a degen, you should be like a regen, or like instead of a degenerative, you should be a regenerative type of financial system. So I was wondering if you could actually explain a bit what that is, and how that's even possible. Because I think to some people, like when you think about finance, you think of like the only idea we have of finance is like Wall Street, basically.
Yeah. So I think we're trying to discover what regenerative finance could really mean. I mean, we were fortunate that the mimetic structure of DeFi and degens kind of set us up. Yeah. So we are capitalizing hard on this regen narrative. But that's really the idea. And I think the crux of it is, going back to the kind of sustainability existentialism and how does an organism exist in a universe that's always running down? It's a matter of like actually representing internally your environment and your real world processes, right? And so much of let's say degenerative finance stems from the fact that it's so decoupled from the real world, from real world trade, from the things that actually keep people alive, from real inputs, from the sort of ecological basis of our, and even human action and labor basis of our reality, that it's inherently degenerative because it doesn't actually represent anything real, right?
Which is not unlike Wall Street, I would add.
Yeah, I was really kind of talking about Wall Street and
as like kind of the same,
in the same breath, right?
Sure.
And so that's exactly right, and that's a lot of the concern. Now, I would caveat that just a little bit by saying that there are innovations happening both in the blockchain layer and in the DeFi layer that are really, I think, really profound, and that can have a big impact on political economy and hopefully help resolve certain outstanding issues in kind of international macroeconomics, let's say. And maybe that's naive or hopeful or optimistic to think that these crypto nerds are going to come up with things that are going to solve 200-year-old problems like let's say like the Triffin dilemma or the trilemma of international economics, where you have challenges either issuing a reserve currency or managing the sort of trade balances between countries. Stuff we could get into all that and how DeFi might help there. So there is something really interesting happening there that could be applied. We're not seeing it applied yet, but the problem is that essentially these things aren't really connecting to real world processes, and that's where the regen idea comes in, right? That we need to actually ground this stuff in the real world, in ecological health, in regenerative behaviors for the planet and for ourselves. And that's really where Cosmos is trying to focus. Even though we do have a great set of degens and DeFi and a lot of innovation happening there within the Cosmos because the tools enable that. There's also a very strong contingent that's focusing on this regen aspect, like the Regen network, the IXO network. We're working with grassroots economics. It's another project in Kenya to start to use the Cosmos tech and other sort of local currencies. And in particular, the thing I'm most kind of interested in is, and I consider this basically the sort of policy outcome from sustainability existentialism. So if you start from that philosophical basis, you end in what I've been calling monetary localism, again, made up term, so you don't get to have connotations for it. But it basically implies much more locally grounded supply chains and self-sustainability in communities. And the way to do that is kind of by reformulating money at a more local level and building it out of basically trade credit. And so allowing communities to extend credit to each other internally and kind of building a web of obligations out of that and building a money on top of that and then trying to sort of stitch them together into a global system. That's at least kind of the idea. But yeah.
Yeah, it sounds to me like in terms of the difference between degen and regen is that with regen we're talking really, I mean, kind of like what you said. I mean, about community currencies, about local money, and about, I mean, potentially, probably as well, mutual credit systems that are more grounded in a smaller economy, and therefore, like, I imagine there are arguments as to why that is better for sustainability or better for the environment, rather than having some sort of like totalizing monetary system like what we do with, with the US dollar, euro, whatever.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's also, systems like the Regen network, which are focusing also on like, global carbon credits and ecological monitoring and how to incentivize people to actually regenerate, perform regenerative agriculture and take care of their land and rivers and stuff like that. So there is kind of a global element to it, and you can, there probably is still room for global coordination and regenerative global finance, let's say.
Right. But it's sort of like, I guess, like the Cosmos is sort of like this layer of allowing for these local monies to sort of appear and happen, but still have this interoperability layer. But it's not like, I wouldn't want people to come away with thinking that like, oh, regen is just degen, except like with trees on top or something.
That's certainly a risk. That is just like the same degen incentives and behavior, but
that is greenwashing.
Exactly. So there's certainly a risk of that, and that's something I'm also worried about. But I have a somewhat incrementalist, I think, approach or iterative approach, and so I think there are ways to leverage. I don't want to say leverage greenwashing in the right direction, but sort of. It's always a battle, right? Like you have good intentions but you're trying to operate in existing political economic conditions, existing market conditions. You need funding, you need to incentivize investors. So it's always a battle to sort of manage these competing interests. And most of the leverage is on the side of the capital, ultimately these days. And that, pushes you in the direction of, it just being greenwashing or whatever. But hopefully the sort of underlying structures of like sovereignty and interoperability can help communities express these more, locally grounded values and sustainability values, and that will start to emerge. But yeah, it's a battle.
So throughout this conversation, of course, people may have noticed that Ethan has very heterodox political views, and I think they're very, very interesting ones, and it's very different from like the average crypto bro, whatever you want to call it. So I wanted to sort of like go into that because this is, of course, also a political podcast besides just a blockchain one. But so maybe you can tell us like an overview of like, I guess where you got your heterodox political thinking from. And if you could explain a bit your political journey. As you've mentioned, you like to use terms that don't have connotations with them. So that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, that's my way out of getting put in boxes. I should caveat this by with a admission of humility, I guess, that like I am very much an amateur political philosopher, political economist, and I've only really started a deeper investigation in the last year, reading classic texts and so on. So I'm still trying to put together the history of economic ideas and how it all fits. The thing that has been pretty steady for me is this kind of sustainability existentialism, this idea that, which is derived from my biophysics. And I think something like 10 years ago, I tried to write a blog post called like How to Derive Politics from Physics, which basically leads to a kind of localism. And what I'm now calling monetary localism, because I've come to believe that money is actually a very important social relation and institution in society that needs to be completely reformulated. So the grounding of sustainability existentialism, let's say, is this problem of sufficiently representing your environment and your boundaries in order to take advantage of external energy inputs and incorporate them and sustain yourself, right? And this is something that organisms and ecosystems do very well, and is something that is actually, contrary to the what might be seen as like a contradiction of the second law of thermodynamics, that entropy is always increasing. This tendency actually supports it, and so the underlying concept there is that basically lower entropy forms, so better organized forms, can be better able to dissipate incoming energy than not, right? And so you can think about the fact that like humans exist and organisms exist and all this is because those systems, even though they're low entropy, highly organized emergent systems, they exist and they're thermodynamically favorable because they do a better job of dissipating the incoming sunlight than a barren rock would, right? If you just have a rock, the sunlight, a lot of the sunlight will just sort of bounce out. Whereas what these organisms and living systems do is they harness that incoming energy and they sort of cycle it through many processes, stepping down iteratively, dissipating slowly as heat over time. And on net, they produce more heat in the universe than they would have if they didn't exist, right? So you get this kind of, life is this, the way I put it is this like inevitable yet absurd phenomenon where the beauty in the form of, this emergent form is derived from its superiority in destruction, its ability to actually increase the entropy of the universe faster. And so maybe this means we're hastening the heat death of the universe and so on. And, if you want to resolve that, you can read Isaac Asimov's The Last Question. That's sort of where I stop there. And then we can come back to the politics and what it means for society. But essentially, I think what it means is that we need to think about our energy inputs as a society, where they come from, what their limits are, and we need to match up our internal structure to actually represent that. That's to say that internal structure of society or of an organism contains literally a model of the environment and of the energy that drives it, right? The driving signals, you would say, in sort of non-equilibrium physics. And that model contains information, and the amount of information it contains about the environment, the effectiveness of the model you contain within you for predicting the environment, is actually directly related to your sustainability and your ability to sort of harness incoming energy and changes in that energy and reproduce and sustain yourself. And we do a very bad job in society today of accurately representing our environment, our energy inputs, what sustains us in our institutional structure. A lot of this is due to the way we harness energy, fossil fuels, or sort of, we're kind of subsidized by the history of the Earth with all the sunlight stored up in the, geologically, and that's a big problem. We sort of count these. People count this as income on their books when it's actually burning the assets of the earth. So there's kind of an accounting problem there. This is sort of the grounding of what I would call the sustainability existentialism. And as you start to reason through it, you find very strong justifications for more local political economic structuring because, these are sort of classic information theoretic arguments that at a large scale, certainly at the globe or even at the nation state, large nation states, highly centralized institutions, there are limits on the bandwidth that they have and on their ability to synthesize and accurately represent their environment. And this sort of forces you to push the model and the representation down to a more local level where you can effectively synthesize and build a model that responds accurately to the environment. And so you find yourself in more of a political economy of the kind of the Ostroms and the commons governance and stuff like this that's much more localist oriented than any kind of global political regime or something. So that's kind of a basis, and we could go into a lot more, I'm sure.
Hey everyone, if you're enjoying this episode so far, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, share with a friend, and join the crypto leftist communities on Discord or Reddit, which you can find links to in the show notes. If you're enjoying the interview or find the content I make important, you can pitch into my efforts starting at $3 a month on patreon.com/theblockchainsocialist to help me out and join the newest patrons like Kevin, Meme is me twice, Ben, Chronivore, Lance, and Jorge. Any amount really helps since making this stuff isn't free in terms of money or time. As a patron, you'll get a shout out on an episode like I just did and access to Patreon exclusive content like Q&A episodes where you can submit and vote on questions you'd like me to answer, and I'll give my thoughts in roughly 20 minutes. Of course, I'll still be making free content like this interview to help spread the message that blockchain does not need to be used for furthering capitalist exploitation if we put our efforts into it. So if that message resonates with you, I hope you'll consider helping out. Also, just wanted to mention I recently published my first blog in a while directly on my website, theblockchainsocialist.com. That is basically a response to another piece written by Paris Marx and his criticisms of Web3. I wrote the response as a way to highlight what I think a lot of people on the left get wrong about Web3 and how instead I think we should be engaging with it. But that's it from me. Let's get back to the interview with Ethan Buchman. It sucks you weren't at the Crypto Commons gathering. I don't know if you had heard about that conference. That there was a lot of talk about, of course, Austrian and commons governance and how that all works. But it seems like a big part of your focus is on localism, and sort of like, or I guess like prioritizing, like how do we solve the local issues first, and then get to. But at the same time, what's interesting is that Cosmos is still providing that sort of like layer of interoperability. And, I'm just thinking about like, how, political thinking sort of like influences like technological architecture, I guess you could say. And that I think what's interesting, I don't know if you've read much about stuff from like the Peer-to-Peer Foundation.
A little bit, yeah.
Their idea of like thinking things in the like Cosmo locally.
Yeah.
So I feel like I imagine that could have been an inspiration. Like when I'm hearing you speak, it sounds similar to like those ideas that they've professed.
Yeah, exactly. The sort of localism I'm talking about is not a isolated kind of one-off community fending for itself kind of thing. It is this more polycentric, multi-scale localism where you actually, because your energy inputs and the driving signals are also multi-scale, which is to say that you need multi-scale representations, right? And so there are things that you want to represent at the most local level possible, and then there, which is to say the individual or the family or whatever, and then there are things you want to represent at higher and higher orders, and we need to kind of, learn what kind of external driving signals need to be represented at what levels and form sort of, better models of society, and have this kind of multi-scale localism that allows us to go basically from local to global and back. Is sort of how I've been putting it. Yeah.
One of the more interesting talks that I've heard you give was around this idea of the distributed state. I thought that was a really interesting one. It had a lot of localist type of thinking in it. So I was wondering if you could give us a quick crash course on that and your thoughts around what a distributed state is.
Sure. Yeah. So this is my classic talk on the brief history of distributed state. Where my understanding of like what we're doing as a society is really this kind of state machine replication, in the sense that each of us has a model in our head. You can tell I think a lot in terms of information theory and models and how we model each other and understand each other in that kind of way. But each of us has models of the world in our head, and there are like implicit rules in our society and our social norms and so on. And what we're trying to do is we replicate these things over time to our children and to maintain our social relations and the structure of our society, and that that is this kind of process of distributed state and of that state's replication. And what I like to point out is that I think there's a kind of an analogous process happening in the distributed state functions in sort of geopolitical history and in networked digital infrastructure. Where we started in a world, let's say, of villages and city states on the one hand, and like individual computers and intranets on the other. So that's the sort of first stage where you just have these like small, kind of isolated, self-sufficient, fend for themselves. You don't really have to worry about much beyond their borders. There's not much interoperability or anything like that, and there's sort of, you know, somewhat primitive initial states of this, right? And then you move on from that stage into the era of geopolitically what I call somebody else's empire, right? And digitally somebody else's computer, which is sort of the cloud, right? And so you have the great empires of history, Alexander the Great, and you know, and so on, who come in and sort of combine all these self-sufficient city-states or villages into an overarching empire. And there's a sacrifice in terms of the, you know, the stateful relationships. You basically have to give up some of your sovereignty. You have to adopt some of the imposing culture, let's say. And, you know, and there's a trade-off there, because now the empire will protect you, its army will protect you, but you have to pay taxes and so on. And same with, you know, Jeff Bezos and, you know, his computing empire. I mean, he's like the Alexander the Great of our time, trying to unify the world into his cloud. And again, there's that trade-off where, okay, you have to pay higher taxes, higher fees to Amazon. But on the flip side, you get all this infrastructure and it's high availability, or at least they claim, and, you know, they keep your servers up. But, you know, if they don't like you, they can shut you off. Just like if, you know, the Macedonians didn't like you, they could smite you or suffocate your religion, even though they were relatively tolerant, as far as I understand. Anyway, the problem with this kind of this empire approach is that the underlying substructure of society is too varied for a single kind of state, a single set of rules to apply broadly to all of them to really represent the underlying stakeholders, right? And so you get this kind of commotion, you get rebellion, right? And so geopolitically, this was the rebellions of the nation states, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and sort of everyone else that came with their own nation state. And in the digital network realm, we have the cryptocurrencies, which are sort of sovereign nations in their own right, defecting from the cloud and trying to establish their own, you know, kind of infrastructure that can sustain itself independently of this larger empire, and that has sort of become the primary mode of society and of digital networks now. Let's say, not that everyone's using blockchains yet, but that's sort of where we're at. But the problem there is that you still have the same issue. You've made progress. You have all these states with their own constitution that better represent their citizens, that, you know, give them more voice in political elections and so on. And they're kind of interoperable. They trade across countries or whatever. But we're still at a point where the civilization underneath, the constituency, is too complex to be represented by a single state machine, right? And so trying to unify these massive geopolitical bodies, you know, the entire United States or the entire Europe, let's say, it's too much for a single state to effectively represent the underlying interests of the stakeholders. And so we're seeing this like intense, you know, factioning and all this like political fallout, and, you know, accelerated by social media and so on. And we see the same thing in the blockchain realm, that these single state machines of, you know, Bitcoin or Ethereum or whatever, they're not robust enough. They're not, you know, they don't have enough bandwidth to adequately represent their stakeholders. And so they fork, right? And so Bitcoin forked, and we had Bitcoin Classic because there was a divide over what Bitcoin should be, and Bitcoin Cash and Ethereum Classic, yeah, because there was a divide over how to respond to the DAO and so on. So you see this happening there as well, that these like single, you know, political states essentially are insufficient to adequately represent the interests of the stakeholders. And so the question is sort of, okay, well then what comes next, right? And the sort of idea here is that actually finally we get this kind of merger of these two realms, of the digital network and the geopolitical realm, into this world of an internet of blockchains, right? Where we sort of descale a little bit again to more local, more representative political structures, smaller scale states and so on, that provide more sovereignty at a more local level, that can better represent their constituencies, but in a way that is highly interoperable with all the others. And this is sort of the you know, Cosmos is trying to provide the sort of technical foundation for that, the new form of blockchain design and interoperability, to enable this sort of political economic trend of, you know, more power to municipalities and more local communities, essentially, to bring about a more representative, let's say, global system that better bridges the gap from local to global and back. And so that's sort of the idea behind the brief history of distributed state, that we're sort of coming upon this convergence between these two threads, these two parallel threads, and that convergence is in this sort of sovereign interoperable political economy that Cosmos is trying to enable through the technology, through the interoperability protocols and so on, but is fundamentally a social concern, a problem of social scalability, right? Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's a really interesting approach, and I sympathize with a lot of it. I have a sticker on my computer that says there's no such thing as a cloud, just someone else's computer.
Yeah, exactly.
I guess for me, what I take out of that, this story is like that. Like to me, I don't know necessarily what's missing, but like what I get is like imperialism. It's sort of like in the way that the system is set up. Jeff Bezos is sort of incentivized to need to constantly expand his empire for increasing the amount of profits that he makes, because sort of, I would argue from my perspective that capitalism is sort of designed in a way just sort of inherently for this competition between capitalists to occur. And so if he doesn't do it anyway, someone else is going to do it. And so, the incentives sort of like push him to that direction. And I think the same thing could have been said for, you could think of the Roman Empire as well. They were really, really dependent to upkeep their empire, to have to expand beyond their borders, to, get all the resources that they could, because they constantly needed more in order to feed the people. They're really dependent on slave labor and such and such. To me, it's really like this question of imperialism and like the need to expand into new markets as sort of like part of the problem here. But I do really like the approach of thinking, I think there's on one side of some political spectrums where we're just like, come on, man, we'll just like go local and like we'll just like live in our little communes in the forest or whatever. But like we live in the world's already globalized. We're like way past that point,
Yeah, exactly.
So there needs to be some sort of way for even if you do want to live in a hippie commune in the forest, you got to talk to the other hippie communes on the other side of the world, something, exactly, to coordinate in some way. But one thing that I found interesting is that, at least from what I've read, is that like you have some like sympathies with like Austrian economics and some, I think some things you agree with Austrian political economists. But to me, localism seems really, really antithetical to Austrian economics.
Yeah, it certainly looks that way. I have this problem where I'll like project a little bit what I want to believe about what people are saying, because like I want to just agree with everyone, and so this challenge is actually seeing in an unbiased way what they're saying. I think there's a few sides to this. On the one hand, I think the Austrians hit this point of what I've been calling like arrested development, where they failed to follow themselves to their sort of logical conclusions of their economics, because they got caught up in this like reactionary political effort, right? Dealing with like, okay, post World War II and what happened and what was fascism and Nazism and socialism, and like, oh, it's really scary, and so we have to really fight back. And in doing so, I think they kind of somewhat lost their roots and failed to actually like further their analysis to really understand what they were talking about, and where it would go politically. And obviously their ideas were then co-opted by some of the like worst states, most oppressive states, say in the West, like in Reganism and Thatcherism and so on. We've gotten this like terrible neoliberalism that has arguably derives from the work of the Austrians, which I think is not something they would necessarily have wanted, but I haven't really spoken to them, so I can't say. I wrote a thread recently trying to sort of trace out my understanding of where they went wrong and kind of what happened here. And my impression is that like I said, they got caught up in this sort of reactionary political struggle and failed to sort of go back to the sort of economic roots, but that the Austrian thought actually concludes or matures in the work of the Ostroms and in the work of a more sort of institutional economics, which they in some sense predated, in another sense didn't quite follow up on. But I think is a sort of logical outcome. And then there is some interesting work about, the indirect influence of the Austrian thought, or at least Hayek's thought, say, on the Ostroms. And I think Hayek was a little bit more subtle or tempered in his understanding, and was, say, much more of a localist maybe than the others. There's certainly, of course, like a fundamental localism to Austrian thought in their methodology of the sort of methodological individualism and reasoning from the perspective of purely of the individual and, purposeful human action and this kind of thing. But I think they certainly missed a lot of key insights on the structure of society and the problem of representing your boundaries and and all this. So I sympathize with a lot of their early work because they were some of the first to really try to reason rigorously about the time structure of production and the consequences of sort of abusing money, which I think were really important and they were effectively right about, but they didn't really provide a reasonable alternative, so they kind of got ignored. And Minsky would come along like a few decades later and take all the credit for kind of financial instability and problems with credit and so on. So I think there's some really interesting history there of the difference between, say, Minsky's business cycle theory and which has pretty much been like kind of widely adopted now, especially post 2008, and then the Austrian business cycle theory, where the Austrians were like, well, yeah, like obviously if you let banks and governments just like issue money, you're going to get booms and busts. You're going to get all kinds of malinvestment and overconsumption, and and so obviously it's bad. And they kind of stopped there, whereas Minsky sort of dove in a little bit more to map out the actual web of obligations and say something about, well, so a big government could step in and settle this, which I don't necessarily agree with either. But so, anyways, I think I have quite a lot of respect for the Austrian tradition in their economics and some aspects of their politics, and especially Hayek, I sympathize a lot with. And I do consider him more of a localist, and I think more modern Austrians, I think, sometimes throw out Hayek as like, oh, he was too much of a statist or whatever. He wasn't like hardcore enough, and he wanted companies to issue their own fiat money, and so to hell with him because only gold is money or whatever. And so obviously I sympathize more with Hayek than the, say, Rothbardians on that front, but. It is interesting how the pure Austrian tradition kind of climaxed in a kind of anarchism, this free market anarchism, which one of the things I'm trying to understand now is how it relates to the sort of 19th century, left-wing anarchism, Proudhon and others, and really how those things differ in their understanding of property and so on. So that's sort of new space for me to explore, but. I like the idea that the Rothbardians are this kind of moronic cult. I think George Selgin said that or something, and I'm okay with that. But I sympathize with a lot. Let's just say I sympathize with a lot of heterodox schools. So I think they all have a grain of truth, and the Austrians included, even though they're traditionally considered far right or whatever. I think that's a unfortunate mischaracterization resulting from missteps in later years due to the historical circumstance.
Yeah, I personally have only read a little bit of Hayek, but most of what I read, I mean, I didn't really agree with. I think like it was mostly the information one, the like why socialism is can't handle or like planning is impossible because of like there's too much information and therefore you need a price to sort of like collapse all that. I read that one, but it wasn't. I can see how it was convincing for other people. It wasn't so convincing for me. I felt like we've kind of I don't know. I just felt like, well, technology has progressed quite far since Hayek, and as well, like Amazon and Walmart already are basically central planners of the economy to a certain extent, or logistics and supply chain is basically a form of planning, and they're able to pull it off. Yes, fun fact. Libertarian actually, I don't know if you know this, but it used to mean socialist when it was first derived. It came from, I believe, one of the anarchists, could have been Proudhon or someone else. And then at a certain point, it was co-opted by, what ended up becoming, I think, was just like a group of economists that were like strongly influenced by the Austrians. And then somehow, I don't know how I really, like when I read into that history, I'm like, how in the world, like, did they get to anarchism? Like, it seems like there was like it's like a circle, like they were not really like the same strands or whatever of like politics, but then they just sort of like came together at the end, like, oh, we're anarchists too.
Yeah, exactly. Which I think is really interesting and says a lot about the somewhat localist nature. I think the Austrians failed to, or at least in my understanding, failed to really account for land and the theft and exploitation that is sort of inherent in private ownership of land. And so I think a lot of their results are fine in when applied to like the production process and sort of the basic capitalism of say like a classic savings base. You save up money by deferring consumption today and you invest it to produce something tomorrow. Like there's something very sound and fundamental of that from the perspective of like actually using the resources you have to represent the world and make predictions about the world, and going back to the sustainability existentialism. But when land gets tied up in that, because land isn't the fruit of any human's labor, it's something that was sort of endowed to us, and there's the theorizing I think breaks down, and there's sort of missing an ethical foundation. So on the heterodox front, as you said, I have a heterodox political philosophy, which I love to hear that. I'm somewhat on a mission to synthesize the heterodox strands of economics, because like the mainstream is so obviously fundamentally broken. And I wrote this post recently trying to think through what this looks like, and it's called Reconsidering the Factors of Production. So in the mainstream, the factors of production are just like labor and capital, and there are these like aggregate numbers, and there's no heterogeneous substructure, and they feed into a production function, and that's kind of and they just do a bunch of math from there. Whereas first of all, I think you need to separate land out from capital, because it's very different. Capital is really stored labor. Land is something else. It's not the result of any human's labor. It's part of the endowment, and it belongs to all of us. And to the extent we have private property over it, we'll probably do something seriously wrong. And then I think we also need to include kind of fundamentally energy and money as factors of production, because of the impact they have on the way we organize society. And so if you take those 5 kind of factors, I think one or two heterodox schools kind of maps to each of them. And so what we need for like a proper political economy is a proper social theory of each of these 5 factors of production, and an ethical basis for all of them, and a really developed, let's say, sociology around all of them that we can then sort of integrate into what it implies for how we should organize our political economy. And so you could think that the Georgists and the ecological economists sort of apply to land, and you've got the institutionalists and the feminists and the Marxists on labor, and you've got the Austrians and the post-Keynesians on capital, and you've got the ecological economists again, on energy, and then maybe the Austrians and post-Keynesians again on money or something like that. And so there's, I think, a synthesis to be had of all these different views. Maybe if you prescribe or subscribe literally to the very words that each great thinker said, it might be difficult to synthesize them all. But given everything we've learned, and sort of this maybe sustainability existentialist kind of framing can help us with a synthesis. So that's sort of, I'm trying to draw on all the different traditions and sort of see the best in all of them, and see how we can synthesize to come up with something more complete that has a proper, like I'm saying, sociological theory or representation of each of the factors. I think that's quite important.
Yeah, it's I think important to, at the very least, like divide it into smaller chunks that you can sort of more easily, come to a solution to, or like come to any sort of conclusion. Because when we talk about the economy, we're just like we're talking past each other, or like we're talking about vastly different things, and it happens all the time. But one of the people that I've noticed that you've written about, who's had some influence on you, was Karl Polanyi, who, from what I understand, he's like kind of a socialist. He was at the very least married to a communist, as far as I understand. And he said this thing where that he said labor, land, and money are sort of fictitious capital.
Yeah, fictitious commodities.
Yeah, or fictitious commodities. Yeah. I thought pretty interesting take. And I assume it sounds like at the very least land you agree with.
Yeah, well, I think he's right about all 3. And that's critical to a proper understanding, because if you just treat all these things like commodities, then you get the kind of economic confusion we're in today. Commodities are things that are produced for sale on the market. Of course, Marx did kind of detailed analysis of labor power as a commodity and the problems inherent there. And he's right in the sense that labor is not a commodity. It's not produced for sale on the market. It is like the inherent life of a human being, right? That's not.
But it's treated as such.
It's treated as such in our sort of economic theorizing, but that's not what it is substantially, right? And so Polanyi tried to pierce that veil in his book, The Great Transformation. Is just an incredible book. So he wrote that, I think, in 44 or 45, and Hayek wrote The Road to Serfdom. They were both published around the same time, and they both tried to explain, like, you know, why the wars happened, like, or why fascism happened and why World War II happened. And they had, like, completely opposite conclusions. Hayek was like, socialism ruined everything, right? And Polanyi was like, no, free market capitalism ruined everything. And I think they're both right in, like, you know, interesting fundamental ways. And, you know, I think both of them had a lot of insights. There's a tremendous amount of insights in both those books. I think the Hayek book is shorter and maybe a little bit more shallow, let's say. Polanyi goes very deep into the sort of history and anthropology of social relationships and gives a proper analysis of, you know, the emergence of the market society that we find ourselves in today. And it's kind of disembedding from, you know, from society at large, right? It used to be that economics was kind of subservient to a larger society and it came to dominate it. And that was something that was explicitly constructed. And it was through that land and labor and money became these, you know, commoditized or thought of as commodities, these fictitious commodities, even though they're really not. And that's what led us so astray. So I highly recommend that book. You know, there's some things that are maybe naive or not perfect. He wasn't an economist by training. I learned recently that he tried to contribute to the socialist calculation debate. So I think what you're sort of referring to earlier about Hayek and the information theory arguments, in my opinion, that the Austrians won that debate. And the you know, the Hayek argument is quite convincing, and we could get into that a little bit. And I think it relates to this sort of, you know, representation problem I've been talking about sustainability. And obviously, some of the political conclusions were wrong, but markets and prices do play a fundamental role that can't just be replicated by technology. You do need this, like, emergent, you know, individuals making choices and to express it. That's not to say that prices should be used for everything or specifically, you know, labor and land, for instance, because there are deep problems with that, which I don't think the Austrians treated sufficiently. So Polanyi tried to contribute, so he had to read the Austrian literature and try to catch up on, you know, to speak in their own language, and he tried to make a contribution. And from what I understand, he didn't really succeed. It was very convoluted and difficult for him to sort of, you know, contribute properly to the debate, and he ended up sort of giving up on the language of economics and moved more to sort of history and anthropology, and wrote the Great Transformation instead, and sort of told that story, which is phenomenal and I highly recommend, and I think actually captures a lot of what his what his argument would have been in the socialist calculation debate. So maybe folks will read that and take another stab at the, you know, making the Polanyi-esque argument about socialist calculation, which I think was, you know, people have very different, divergent definitions or understandings of what socialism is or means. And, you know, I think there is kind of a brand of socialism that is certainly not about overarching state planning. There's a role for the state, and even Hayek would admit there's a role for the state in a way that's, I think, quite similar to Polanyi. And so it's more sort of about, you know, in this calculation debate, what are the things that can or should be calculated, and how do we actually represent you know, value that is difficult to materialize as a price, right? Like the value of labor, the value of sort of externalities, and so on. I think that's kind of what Polanyi was trying to get at also in the Great Transformation, which is, you know, still insufficiently represented in our price systems and our market systems today, and it is really the great challenge, and why I've become sort of so obsessed with money and monetary theory and monetary institutions, because money is sort of the primary means by which we express value today. And it's so broken, and the kind of unidimensional nature of it, it's like this, you know, this very low dimensional projection of a high dimensional concept, which is value, right? Like value isn't something that can just be expressed in US dollars until the end of time. And to think it can is absurd. And obviously, you know, the Austrian tradition got carried away with thinking that we could just have this globalized, you know, economic system. And so, yeah, sorry to tangent.
No, it's fine. I think
but one thing I wanted to say. So Polanyi had, I wrote this down because I think it was really interesting. So there were two. So in the Great Transformation, the impression I get from Polanyi is that he basically thinks almost every economist that came before him is wrong. Not that he's necessarily an economist, but he has he lumps them all in together. He's got this passage about Marx and George and Smith and Ricardo and all of them. They're they all have the same kind of view, and so, you know, they're all missing the point. And the only person who got it right was Robert Owen. And before I read The Great Transformation, I didn't know who Robert Owen was. And then, I saw Polanyi like raging about Robert Owen. I better look this guy up. And it turns out he's the founder of the cooperative movement. And I was like, this is a man after my own heart. So
he's who Marx and Engels described as like the first utopian socialist.
Utopian socialist, yeah, as a way to sort of denigrate them, even though their socialism was arguably a lot more realist than Marx's kind of revolutionary socialism. But so Polanyi had this quote. So I wrote this down because I wanted to share it. So one was that Robert Owen, he was saying something like he was the only one to really understand the nature of the state and its relationship to society, and he looked to the state merely for that which it could perform. Helpful intervention designed to avert harm from the community, emphatically not the organizing of society, which I think is probably something that Hayek would agree with. And he makes quotes not dissimilar from that in The Road to Serfdom and even some other of his works. And then later, Polanyi actually offers a sort of tentative definition of socialism to him, which he says is socialism is essentially the inherent tendency in an industrial civilization to transcend the self-regulating market by consciously subordinating it to a democratic society, right? So it's this idea that economics shouldn't be this all-pervading force that sort of controls everything, but it's actually subservient to society. It's a part of society. It's regulated by society, and even constructing the self-regulating global market is a social phenomenon. Required the state to set up all these different things in a way that was quite destructive, and ultimately the breakdown led to the world wars or whatever. But so I think those are kinds of definitions that I could resonate quite a bit with, and I think share a lot with the kind of sustainability existentialism, properly representing your boundaries, understanding all the different relations, and not just being naive enough to think that everything can be expressed in prices.
Yeah, I think. First off, I think a lot of people sort of get the wrong idea that socialism is only like when the state does things, and like the more the state does things, the more socialist it is. Yeah. And if it does a lot of things, then it's communism. Yeah, exactly.
So I think I have this impression that like communism kind of ruined socialism for everyone else, right? It was like that Marx and Engels came along, they were like, oh, all the socialists before us were utopian. They weren't scientific enough. We'll show you scientific socialism. And, the outcome is this like revolution and communism across the whole world. And then, what followed was like, decades of genocide wherever it was tried. So now everyone has a bad taste in their mouth about the idea of socialism. But
I mean, yeah, I would disagree with that. but like, I think that, I don't think they necessarily denigrate other socialists to that much. I think it was more like at the time, the way I understand it is that you had this is the 19th century, where either you were like a race scientist measuring people's skulls and saying why like certain races are inferior to each other, like, or you were a socialist, which was like a very generic term at the time. And it was, you had then Proudhon came along and said, well, I'm an anarchist, and started this whole movement around his thoughts and anarchism. But generally, I think the impression is that the anarchists were a bit too like, more like we just like we need to hold hands and like peace and love, and like we'll like love our way into a better society. And then Marx sort of came around and said like, no, there are like opposing interests between capital and labor, and that these contradicting interests cannot be sort of resolved simply by making friends with everybody. There sort of needs to be something more to it. But so I mean, for me, when I read Marx, when I read Engels, I felt like it was, I don't know about scientific. It's hard to be like scientific about like history, but I did feel it was a bit more empirical at the very least.
Yeah, that's fair. My understanding is they were trying to denigrate with the like utopian label. It was like, oh, this could never work. You're too utopian. Here's how to do it sort of right.
I think a bit. I mean, like there. I think that's kind of. I mean, that's if you go like really to the core of the conclusion, then like yeah, that's kind of what they're saying. But I don't think they mean it in a way of like they. I mean, they of course partnered with and then like got into fights with anarchists all the time. So
right. Fair enough. Yeah.
But like with to get back to the planning stuff, I don't know if you've ever read the book, The People's Republic of Walmart.
No.
That's a really interesting one where they try to go and talk about, well, they sort of like challenge, Hayek's book on the information theory and the socialist calculation debates, and sort of go into it. And what's really interesting for me then is that, like, at least their argument that companies, like giant multinational companies, have basically solved the socialist calculation debate.
No. Because companies have a bottom line. They're driven by prices and profit. They prove his results. They don't contradict it.
Oh, how do you mean?
The whole point is that without price signals to sort of drive your behavior and do the computation for you, you don't know how to properly allocate resources, right? And Walmart is not, a socialist or like a public good company. They have a bottom line. They're trying to make money, right? And everything they do is exposed to prices. And of course, it's not to say they don't have like elements of monopoly control, that they're not doing planning. The problem isn't about the ability to plan per se. Obviously, planning is sort of a core part of this colloquial word, planning is a core part of, say, the Austrian tradition, and the capitalist has to be able to plan for the production process and how it will evolve in time. But they use prices to do that, right? And so Walmart is something that's very heavily dependent on prices. It's very cost sensitive, right? So the fact that it can achieve so much is actually unfortunately, because I'm not a big fan of, say, Walmart or Amazon and the way they're kind of conquering the world, but it's unfortunately proof of the power of prices to organize production rather than contradiction, I think.
The argument is more internal to Walmart and internal to Amazon, is that they don't use prices inside of their own company. Right? They plan their their functions inside. They use different types of software to like predict like what is going to happen, or like what is like the best route for their goods to go, and like how much should they order, when and at what time, and like as opposed to they use the example of, I think it was Sears, which went out of business. But like apparently the head of Sears was like a very, very big like free market guy, and had some sort of like internally to Sears, they had like this type of competitiveness that actually ended up, or like free market type of system inside internal to Sears, that sort of like led to the downfall of Sears. And then as opposed to Walmart or Amazon, where they were much more planned, and they had other these different types of mechanisms to function as a company. Which I thought was like an interesting comparison. I think ultimately the conclusion that they have, of course, is that like, no, we should not like run the country like Amazon or like Walmart. The point is that they've like figured out a lot of these different problems already, and that really the issue with, at least in the case of like Soviet planning, and then of course the issue with giant corporations, is that is very, tends to be very undemocratic. And that's so they advocate for like democratic planning and right. Things like that. So they're really interested in like things like cybersyn and these type of like cybernetic socialist experiments.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. We're getting into here more so like theory of the firm, which I think is where the Austrians didn't go, and where you actually get the sort of institutional economics that I think matures their tradition in, say with the Austrians, where they start to look at, okay, how do we manage like common resources and so on. But I would still say, though, that at the end of the day, Walmart knows what they're looking for. Like, they have a driving signal, which is prices and profit, right? So even though internally they're not using prices and markets to like structure their hierarchy or their relationships, they know if they're doing a good job based on a profit outcome, which is measurable and which does use the price system. Whereas if you try to apply that to a state, you don't have a definitive measure of the correct outcome, the sort of utility that you're providing to everyone, the social welfare or whatever, that is sort of objective, that is not a kind of ad hoc discretionary thing, right? And what Hayek was pointing to is that if you try to use that kind of like planning at the state level without grounding it in sort of price signals, you end up with this like discretionary totalitarian outcome where someone at the end of the day needs to make a decision on what you're going for, and that thing is not gonna reflect the actual larger values of society, because there's inherently disagreements, right? And so he certainly saw a role for the state, and certain kinds of planning, and I think was certainly very supportive of planning internally within a firm to organize the production process. But in my understanding, that doesn't refute the larger information theoretic argument. But I should go review this and read this book, and maybe we can actually have a focused debate on this subject. That could be interesting.
Yeah, and then we can send the pages and pages of Reddit comments arguing back and forth about one thing or another.
Yeah,
would love that.
But it sounds fun.
All right, I'm about at the end of my questions. I figured but was there anything else that you really wanted to mention or to talk about before we finish it off?
Yeah, I think we've covered a lot of ground. I mean, the main sort of arc for me is this, or if we're talking about my sort of political philosophy, is this these factors of production that include energy and money, and the need for a social theory for each of them, which can draw on all these heterodox patterns of economics or heterodox threads, and we can synthesize those. And that I sort of have this grounding in sustainability existentialism, which I think projects into a sort of policy prescription or mode for organizing society around what I call monetary localism, which is to have much more locally organized forms of supply and production, which I think will result in a more sustainable society by stitching together these more local currencies into a global mesh. And that's really what I'm working for, and what a big part of the Cosmos vision is this kind of sovereign interoperability and sort of multi-scale localism or fractal localism that takes us from the local to global and back. And so if that's something you're interested in, check out Cosmos for sure, or check out my writings, tell me why I'm wrong, argue with me on Twitter. That's all good stuff.
Nice, cool, yeah.
Oh, and I should also just say that if you're interested in informal and how we're structured, we have a blog post called Informal Owners that talks a little bit about the background research we did and why we structured ourselves as a cooperative and what other forms were available and what we're targeting. And we're hoping to publish a bit more about the internal structure and how we organize our work, and going back to that theory of the firm stuff that we're just starting to touch on, how we plan production and so on. And so you can follow Informal, subscribe to the newsletter, and we're also hiring engineers and researchers. So if you're interested in, of course, this is all personal political philosophy. I'm the CEO of the company, but I don't represent the views of the company. The company is not a person, despite what the state will tell you.
Yeah.
So this is all personal stuff, but the company obviously has these very strong cooperative values and cares about sovereignty and interoperability and sort of building a more sustainable society as well. So check out Informal Systems, check out the Cosmos Network. Thanks everyone.
Cool, thanks a lot. We'll have to continue these conversations. I think it'd be interesting.